7 billion of the world's 8 billion people live in the emerging markets. This reality is going to shape where the growth opportunities are.
What is this concept of reverse innovation?
We call it trickling up from the developing countries to the developed countries.
Are there any instances where these are originally from emerging economies and the Western economies later on improvise based on what has been created by China?
Think of the innovations coming in battery technology out of China. The innovations the Chinese have done in solar panel production. You can't bring down the cost in an industry by 80% just by being copycat.
What are the things that I should do as a policymaker so that innovation really thrives? This is the Innovation Civilization podcast, and my name is Wahid. My guest today is Professor Ravi Ramamurti, who is the founder director of the Center for Emerging Markets at the Northeastern University in the US. He's also one of the most foremost experts of innovation in the emerging markets. All right, Professor Ravi, welcome to the Innovation Civilization podcast. What a great pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. Wahid, nice to meet you.
Brilliant.
Hello.
Brilliant. And Fizi, welcome back.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So, Professor, let's start off with one of the key concepts that you pioneered early on, and we're just speaking about it offline. So, I think back in the 1980s, as we know, there was this notion that the emerging markets don't have much to offer when it comes to innovation, when it comes to tech, to the global economy. But you coined this term, or you basically, came up with a term and really defined what is this concept of reverse innovation. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by reverse innovation?
Yeah, sure. As you pointed out, most of the innovations since the Industrial Revolution have gone from the developed countries to the developing countries. Then there was a period when the developing countries began to reverse their relative decline. And that was after they became independent countries, after some of them embraced globalization and they opened up their markets to technologies and ideas and capital from other parts of the world. As a result of that process, these countries became more ready to actually offer their own innovations to the rest of the world. Now, this is not a shocking idea. Historically, if you go back to the times before the Industrial Revolution, we had all kinds of amazing innovations come out of ancient civilizations, whether it was China or India or the Middle East and so on. So this is not a new idea, but what we saw about 20 years ago, or what I saw in my exposure to the emerging markets 20 years ago, was the pendulum was beginning to swing back from all of the flow going in one direction to now also some innovations going up. We call it trickling up from the developing countries to the developed countries. We call that reverse innovation.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see, when we first developed the idea, it was about 15 years back, we could see some green shoots of that kind of phenomenon. But I think now it's very clear that this is happening and will continue to happen in the future.
Yeah. And the historical precedent that you mentioned to me is quite interesting, right? But because basically before the Industrial Revolution, if you see, Europe in general was quite poor, right? And America was, I guess, not part of the official economy, and we don't have data on that. But for a large time, Asia used to be the place of innovation. If you see GDP numbers, if you see basically any kind of innovation and stuff. So do you think there's something specific about that period of 18, 19, 20th century, early 20th century where Europe really leveled up? And then is there something special about the last 20 years that, there's this idea that Europe and US is in decline, and so to speak, and the rest of the world is coming up?
Yeah, it's all a relative. I mean, when we say decline of Europe and the US, it's relative because the growth in the emerging markets has finally picked up.
Yeah.
And because they're so much poorer than the developed countries, because they can grow by borrowing technology and ideas and innovations, whereas the rich countries cannot borrow, right? Because they're already at the frontier. By definition, therefore, the emerging economies can grow faster. And they have been growing 2 to 3 times as fast on average compared to the developed countries. But this is not necessarily because they're any better. It's just the advantage of being late. It's the advantage of being behind, that you can learn more faster and therefore improve faster. But to your question about what's happened in the last 20 years or so, that accounts for the capacity of these countries now to start innovating, and actually contributing innovations that may even benefit the developed countries. I think there are a couple of factors. The most important is the faster growth in these countries. When there is faster growth opportunities, because the economies are open, because technology is flowing freely back and forth, and because you are having, foreign components, foreign technologies available to domestic players, you create the conditions where the local firms are now able to innovate. So we've seen changes on the demand side, we've seen changes on the supply side, which have allowed these countries to participate in the growth. And because the needs of these countries are different from the needs of the developed countries, so, meeting those growth aspirations requires innovation. You can't just take what we have here and plonk it in the emerging markets. You might serve, 2% or 5% of the population with those sophisticated products at very high price points. But if you want to reach into the fat middle, as we call it, or even the bottom of the pyramid, you're going to have to innovate. So the local companies did some innovations. The interesting thing is many multinationals also came in and began to participate in innovating for these countries. And the reason they did that was because growth was slowing in their own markets while it was picking up in these markets. Let's not forget a demographic reality. 7 billion of the world's 8 billion people live in the emerging markets. 1 billion live in the developed markets. So at some point, this reality is going to shape where the growth opportunities are. And that is what started to happen when these countries opened up to globalization. So that's the key thing that's happened. It's not as if the problems of poor countries we've never seen them before. They existed before, but either local players didn't have the capabilities to address those problems in the old economic system, or foreign companies didn't have the incentive to bother. In the last 20 years, the local capability for innovation, meaning entrepreneurs, finance, right, deregulation, all of these have made it easier for local players to be able to actually solve the problems that they were seeing in their local markets. And the fact these multinationals have joined them is just adding even more energy to that whole trend.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think this is actually much better because the local folks understand the local problems in a way that multinationals or like Western companies would not, right? Right. Henceforth, the innovations there are much more suited for the local population, right? I think when I was going through your work, what I found quite amazing was that the example of the Indian healthcare system that you mentioned, that they're doing cardiac surgeries for 1% of the cost in the US. To me, that was just mind-boggling. Can you kind of elaborate more on how are they kind of achieving this level of cost innovations as well in order to, do these surgeries and stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's 1 to 3%, depending on who you compare them to. Sure. But it's very, very, very small, and the outcomes are comparable to the outcomes we get in the US, in Mass General or Cleveland Clinic, and so on. So there is a real puzzle here. That's the puzzle we tried to answer when we started the research. The initial expectation was, lower salaries and wages in India may explain this difference. After all, surgery is a labor-intensive, skill-intensive, people-intensive process. So if you need people are cheaper, the procedures will be cheaper. But people don't cost 1% of what they cost in the US, right? In countries like India. In fact, doctors, if you look at their salaries in the emerging markets, it is maybe half of what it is in the developed countries. It's not 1%. And the reason for that is doctors can pick up their bags and go somewhere else, and they're in demand in all parts of the world. So it's not completely a salary or a lower cost explanation. What it is mainly scale and process innovations. The scale comes not because India has more people with heart disease than the US. I mean, India has more people with heart disease, but only 5% of those with heart disease actually get treatment. So the population, the addressable market is actually much smaller, whereas it is much bigger in the US. But what happens in India is that the hospitals feed that demand to a few places and then run those places at very high utilization. Whereas in the US, you got hundreds of hospitals you can go to for cardiac surgery. Volume gets divided between lots of different hospitals. You don't have the efficiencies that you get when you can have a continuous stream of patients going through. And that is where these hospitals have really had the edge. And because of that volume, they have innovated in the process. So I would say compare it to how cars were made by Mercedes-Benz in Germany when each car was assembled by a master craftsman. And the buyer of the car would show up in the factory and spend a week learning how to operate the car, and how to maintain the car, and so on. Then Ford came along and said, hey, there's a better way to make cars, which is the assembly line. It took out 85% of the cost and improved the quality. And people said, wow, this is amazing, until Toyota came along and said, you can take it one more step further. We can make the products 99.999% reliable, meaning every car coming out of the assembly line is a perfect car. And because of that, further bring costs down even more. What these Indian hospitals are doing for healthcare is what Ford and Toyota did for manufacturing. They've shown us how you can get quality to go up and cost to go down at the same time. And I can if you read the book, you'll see lots of different techniques they used to achieve this, but that's the fundamental idea. Whereas we assume in the US that if you have to lower cost, you have to give up on quality. Or if you want to improve quality, you're going to have higher cost. Whereas these hospitals never bought into that. They bought into the idea of, TQM and so on, which came from Toyota, that you can have both higher quality and lower cost at the same time.
So I was wondering, Professor, what other kinds of examples of reverse innovation are there, which basically started from the East and came to the West? I don't think the audience knows much about some of these basically, but what examples come to your mind?
Let me say there were at least two waves of reverse innovation. In the first wave, I'll give you a classic example. A company like GE goes into a country like China with the ultrasound. And, it's ultrasound they sell here in the US hospitals for maybe $100,000. It's big, bulky, and very sophisticated with a user manual this thick. They can sell a few of those in the big hospitals in the big cities. But beyond that, the rest of China finds that it's too expensive, it's too bulky, and it's too sophisticated for their operators to use. A local company came up with a portable ultrasound that cost 10% as much and was maybe 80% as good. And this was exactly what the country needed, because it was portable, it was inexpensive, and it was also less sophisticated and easier to train the operators to use it. Responding to this, GE developed its own version of a portable ultrasound machine that was then a big success in other emerging markets. And here's the surprising part. They found it also opened up new market opportunities in the US. Because you could put the small ultrasound in the ambulance, you could put it in the operating theaters. Every theater could have one. You didn't have to wheel in a big one every time you had to use it. And small doctors' practices who couldn't afford an ultrasound before could afford to want a small one in their offices. So they actually opened up a $200-300 million opportunity in the US. So ultrasound, invented in the US, reinvented in China, then brought back to the US, and becomes a product that creates enormous opportunities for growth for GE across the world. So that's one. Now you can take any product, and I would say almost any service, and imagine a similar reinvention process. A tractor, a car, a diesel engine, right? Any product you can imagine has usually the same set of challenges. Too expensive, too sophisticated, and doesn't have the features you need for these markets. If you develop a product that has those features, you can sell a lot in all the emerging markets, and you may even open up some niches for that product in the developed market. That's one version. Okay? And we've seen this play out now in many, many product lines across many, many multinational companies. The advantage of multinational companies have is once they develop such a product like the portable ultrasound in China, they are very good at moving it to the rest of the world because they already have a presence, they already have distribution. The advantage of local companies is they're better at spotting the opportunities for these kinds of innovations. But they don't have the capacity to move the product globally. So you have this kind of interesting competition going on between the local companies and the multinational companies, where the local companies are trying to learn how to internationalize, while the foreign companies are learning how to make products that are appropriate for the emerging markets. Whoever wins that race wins the global competition. Sometimes it's a local company like Huawei. Sometimes it's foreign companies that have done extremely well learning how to play in the emerging markets. That's one type of innovation. What we're starting to see now, which I think is very interesting, is based on leapfrogging.
Mm-hmm.
And when you leapfrog, countries go straight to the frontier of the industry. For an example, think of telephony. Right? Many of the emerging markets, the first phone anyone had was a cellular telephone. So they went from having no phones to the first phone being sometimes a digital cellular telephone. That's leapfrogging. Right? Once you can leapfrog, you are at the same level as any consumer or any company in the advanced countries. But actually you have an edge over the advanced countries because you're not saddled with the legacy technologies which hold you back. So I still have a credit card. I still carry cash. If you go to China, you go to India, you go to many parts of Asia, nobody carries cash anymore.
That's right.
Right? So online payment, because of the leapfrogging, has grown very, very fast in the emerging markets. What that means is any improvements in that industry are now likely to come from the emerging markets. And so think of e-payments. Which countries have the most advanced e-payment systems? It's the emerging markets. Think of e-commerce. E-commerce in China is many times bigger than the e-commerce in the US. The share of retail happening through e-commerce is higher in China than it is in the US. Even after 30 years, the share of population using cellular telephones only is much higher in India than it is in the US. I still have a landline at home. 30% of Americans still have a landline. That means I don't need to use mobile as much as people in the emerging markets. So innovations that build on mobile platform, for instance, are taking off much faster. E-commerce, e-payments, e-insurance, e-banking, e-education, e-healthcare, go down the list. All of those emerging markets are going to be innovating before the developed markets.
Yeah, Professor, I would like to go back to what you mentioned on innovation from emerging economies. It seems like it's always catching up into something that has already been established by Western economies, and what they do is essentially to make them better and more competitive, hence creating new products on top of that. Could you name perhaps several instances where the concepts introduced by emerging economies are entirely original? You mentioned several examples just now, but it sounded like they were making things better from what is already available in the West. Are there any instances where these are originally from emerging economies and they became the frontier of these developments, and then the Western economies later on improvised based on what has been created by China or the Indian market, for example?
I think China is the prime source of those kinds of innovations so far. Take TikTok. It was not a copycat. TikTok was an original format. The short video, the vertical this and that, all of that was something they pioneered. And, I would not have expected it to be a wild success, but it was. And when it came into the US, the Western companies like Facebook and others tried to copy it, but never had the same success that TikTok had. So that's one example. But if you want to go into something more technologically meaty, think of the innovations coming in battery technology out of China. We just read that BYD has developed a battery that you can charge the car in 5 minutes, the same time it takes to put gas in your car. We don't have that in the West. It's not a copycat. It is an original contribution. The innovations the Chinese have done in solar energy, solar panel production, going all the way back, in the stages of production, those are not simply copycat. You can't bring down the cost in an industry by 80% just by being copycat. The Indian hospitals they're not developing new medical procedures, but they are innovating in healthcare delivery methods. They're doing things that are quite original. So I think people often ask the question you're asking, Fizi, because we feel developing countries or emerging markets have not arrived until they do this kind of innovation, technological breakthrough. And I'm all for that. But the social and economic value of what you call making things a little bit better is enormous. So if you take telephony, if you had taken the model that we had in the US of Verizon and AT&T, which was expensive phone instrument, 2-year contract, high prices, you would have served 5% of the population or 10% of the population. It was the local companies who did basically a business model innovation.
Yeah.
Where they said, we're going to develop cheaper phones, but we're also going to give away, separate the buying of the phone from the buying of the phone service. And we're going to lower the prices very substantially and increase the volumes. And we're actually going to make money by serving consumers who consume very little telephony, but they will also contribute to our profitability. That is what allowed telephony to go from 1 billion people on the planet to 6-7 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
Now, was it just doing things a little better? Maybe, but boy, what was the impact of that? Enormous, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times the business model innovations are as important as the technical innovations themselves, right? I think there's a quote by this technologist, Peter Thiel, who basically said that distribution is more important than product, in many cases, basically, right? I.e., what that means is that you might have a shiny invention, but that might never see the light of the day and get productized, like you were mentioning, Professor, if you don't have the right business and social innovations to wrap that around, basically, right? So that's quite interesting, basically, right?
But it's not as if the developing or emerging markets are not also doing the kind of innovation, Fizi, that you're referring to. I think we're starting to see more of that. I see China as the prime source of those kinds of innovations, whether it's in solar or it's wind energy or it is EVs or batteries or even pharma. I don't know if you're following that. New molecules are coming out of China with the same features, low cost, better performance than existing molecules, and very, very quick development. So the development cycle is also very fast. So speed as a competitive advantage is something China is very, very strong in. And now they're saying in the US in a few years, 30% of new drugs, the molecules may have been developed in China.
Professor, of course, all these points that knowledge-based economy is growing rapidly in China. And often when we read about all the success stories, people would point that the founders would have typically some sort of educational exposure or R&D exposure in the US particularly. But do you still see this as a trend by Chinese companies or R&D operations? Do they still rely on Western-based knowledge, or have they developed an ecosystem where the Chinese education system is good enough that they don't necessarily have to get a PhD from the US anymore for them to develop new ways of the iterative process of innovating new products or services or even new technologies? Professor, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think China may be the only emerging market I can think of where this is already happening. And so there are universities now in China. And I think Hangzhou is a good example, I believe. That's where DeepSeek came from.
Mm-hmm.
And DeepSeek was developed with a lot of local talent. There was not necessarily foreign trained talent. There are publications coming out of China in AI, for instance, that are among the most highly cited articles in the field. There are a number of areas in which, in fact, economists had a very good article compiling the contributions that Chinese scientists are making in a number of fields, chemistry, AI, and so on, material science, where these are original scientific basic research contributions, which are very highly cited. They have a way of measuring, which is a influential article, the article getting a lot of citations, and they see whether the authors are majority Chinese, from China, and so on. And they're finding over time, the gap is closed. In some areas, Chinese scientists are ahead of Western scientists. That means down the road, this is all going to translate into companies and commercialization of ideas. Someone put it very well. Even if China is not the best at going from 0 to 1, China is very good at going from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100. So I may be the one who finds how to go from 0 to 1. But China is the best at commercializing it. And the companies that commercialize it are the ones who are going to make the fortunes.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a bit of reality when it comes to innovation as well, that when you're starting from behind, it's much better to copy things that already work versus trying to reinvent the wheel, right? If you're a country who has lost it in the 20th century, a lot of these former colonized countries, for instance, in Asia, right? They're starting from a lower base of economic prosperity, lower base of institutional capacity, and so on and so forth. If you're trying to catch up, it's almost like it's easier to do what works, right? And then, I don't know, I'm just a layperson, just thinking about this idea. And then when you reach that level of, let's just say, sophistication of your institutions and your knowledge economy, where you can start doing new things, I wonder if that's when, you start seeing those deep R&D things. And probably China, like you said, Professor, is a great example of that. It's on that inflection point where now you see much more of that coming through.
I think China is at that point, is my best guess, because, Chinese scholars read articles written in English. Western scholars don't necessarily read articles written in Chinese. There is therefore an asymmetrical flow of, I think, the ideas back and forth. That plays to China's advantage, actually. And I think the Chinese government is also backing a lot of this more effectively than any other government. Because, in China, when they set these goals, they're not nice to have results. We gotta have those results. There's a capacity to implement, which many other emerging economies don't have. So I think it would be a serious mistake to underestimate the scientific and technological capabilities of Chinese companies and institutions, and the ability to combine, the knowledge with the hardware, because China is unbeatable on hardware. So this combination. So a drone is a good example. It has software and has hardware. Having both co-located, and no other country is very good at both. The US may be good in software, but it's not in hardware. India may be good in software, but is not good in hardware. And so China is the only country that is very strong, has been in manufacturing, but also now over time has built up real capabilities in software. So what they call Industry 4.0, I think China is very well positioned to come through with breakthrough innovations. And there will be more and more of this kind of innovations coming. I mean, they're talking about hypersonic aircraft that was being developed in China that will fly 4 times the speed of sound. Now, there's a state-owned company in the aircraft business, Comac. That has not been a smashing, roaring success. They've been trying for a very long time to make a single aisle commercial jetless like the Boeing 737. But the private companies in China are where the real innovation is happening, not in the state-owned companies.
Professor, you mentioned several elements there. I can break them down as the academia is researching not just based on Western materials, but they're also creating something of their own that's original. And then you mentioned about state investments. Private market is very active in terms of exploring new ideas. But would you say that perhaps the R&D emphasis goes way deeper than those levels that we mentioned? Perhaps something that began at school level, perhaps? Or would the municipals also be responsible in terms of creating this competition among the companies from one municipal to another, that competition itself actually incentivizes R&D by municipals against another one, and hence creating a conducive environment where the best companies will go and get the incentives provided so that they can become more competitive against competitors from other municipals, for example. Well, would you say that has been what's happening in China that really drives the innovation that's based on competition rather than all the external factors that people usually associate to, such as investments from the state-owned companies or the government?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical element. The Chinese market, we don't realize sometimes sitting in the US how competitive it is internally among the local players and their cutthroat competition, really. And that is not the only thing, though. I would say, along with everything else, it makes the whole system a very powerful system for generating new ideas and new companies. So the competition between provinces, the competition between companies, the competition even to get into, the good universities in terms of the exams, the STEM education, the quality of education in the STEM in China, much better than it is in the US. So all of that feeds in to the ecosystem. So you have a lot of talented people, you have the incentives, and you have the institutions to fund that kind of activity, and you have a government that is really quite sophisticated in its understanding of technology. And for me, this was a big puzzle until I read one day that in the Politburo, at the time there were 9 members, all 9 were engineers. China is run by engineers. America is run by lawyers. And so that they appreciate some of these aspects and understand how the state can actually facilitate the development of new technologies. And so that is how they help speed up. So if you take autonomous driving, China is ahead of the US. BYD is ahead of Tesla. But even if Tesla is a very good company and all that, the US does not have the equivalent ability to say, here's a town or a city, we're going to use that as a laboratory for developing autonomous driving. And we're going to work with private companies, encourage them to come here, support it, test it, develop it, and then roll it out in other places. That kind of public-private partnership is much harder to pull off in the US. It is routine in China. So I'd say it's a combination of all of that. But you're absolutely right. I would agree that the competitive intensity is what drives them to achieve this very best product at the very lowest cost and develop them as quickly as possible. This is this triple advantage of speed, ultra low cost, and the very best in terms of technology. That combination you see in China, and that's why I think it's a formidable laboratory for new product development.
Yep. I think there's an observation from Southeast Asia, especially, that all the brands that we consider as prominent out of China have actually survived their own internal competition in China before they became global and compete against the rest of the world, which means that, they're used to intense competition. What more about competing with some other brands from other countries? But on that point, Professor, there's also an issue where Chinese companies, due to their competitive nature, they are also cannibalizing some aspects of local economy. So several Southeast Asian economies have introduced tax measures or even tariff measures, for example, to curb the incoming Chinese companies from eating up all the local competitors. And we have seen this being most dire in Indonesia, where the entry of Chinese companies have actually eradicated six figures of jobs, local jobs in Indonesian markets. So, what's your outlook on how it's going to be for the situation where it's not so much of reverse economy to the West, but rather the technology advancement in China has actually eaten up all the local competitors that are just about to breathe, and now they have to face these Chinese giants that are basically entering the market before they even started. Professor, what do you think?
No, I think that this is a real challenge for not just for the developing countries, but for the developed as well. We're all struggling with the fact that the Chinese capacity to produce is phenomenal. They can supply not only their own needs, they're happy to supply the needs for everybody else on the planet. And as they succeed in doing that, nobody else can catch up with them because they have the scale and the volume that others cannot match. Meanwhile, their own internal market is not growing fast enough. So that is making companies even more desperate to export. And so the rest of the world is taking some of the shock from this process. And I think it creates a tense relationship between Chinese exports and many of their markets, where their exports are flooding. And you see flags of countries made in China. That sort of communicates how difficult it is to compete with them, because the product is almost always pretty good. Deliveries are very fast, and the prices are unbeatable.
Yeah, I wonder, this is where I guess a bit of industrial policy comes in, right? From the nations which are being cannibalized. And Fizi, I think you mentioned tariffs, right? I think some presidents say that tariffs is the best word in the Oxford Dictionary, basically, right? But it is true that, the cost advantages China has, in the production capacities, it's quite remarkable. I think, Professor, you focused a lot of your research on this concept of EMNCs, right? Emerging market MNCs. So I was just curious to dig in a little bit more on that. So, how do they differ with the Western MNCs in particular, what makes them better, basically, and so to speak?
The Western MNCs typically were first movers in their industries. To go back to Fizi's earlier question, they were pioneers. They invented things and created new products that didn't exist before. And they rode that wave. Many of the emerging market multinationals were late to show up. They did not, therefore, internationalize on the strength of having the best and the newest technology. They competed more on having either new business models, which they had developed in order to succeed in their home markets, and then realized that, hey, this can also help me succeed in other markets. Or they had, found new ways to make things, new process innovations that they could then take and, spread to other parts of the world. The kind of companies that Hafizi was talking about earlier, has their company from the emerging market developed new technology, those companies will not be very different from the multinationals of the developed countries. They would, like Huawei today, is not very different from an Ericsson in terms of how it operates and how it competes. It's in many, 150 countries. It's doing cutting edge research. It's spending a very large percentage of its revenues on R&D. It has probably the largest workforce working on R&D. Footprint all over the world, wherever they're allowed to operate. They're not in India. They're not anymore in India. They're not in the US. But Huawei, when you look at it, is not very different from Ericsson, other than the fact they have a very large footprint in China. And so the old legacy cost advantage that they started out with is still an advantage for them, because even after 30 years of development, labor costs in China are still lower than the costs in the West. So I see a convergence, Wahid, to your question. Multinationals from the emerging markets will look very different from the developed country multinationals when they start out. But over a period of time, when they also expand and operate in a number of different countries, they will begin to look more like the developed country multinationals.
And just on that, you mentioned about the cost advantages and the cheap labor, right? So one thing as economies get more developed is that cheap labor is no longer cheap, basically, right? So how do you think like China and some of these countries should deal with that situation? Does that mean you start manufacturing more high-tech stuff, more complex things, and start delegating out the low kind of complex innovations and manufacturing to other countries? I mean, how does it work, basically?
Yeah, I mean, there are three strategies China can use and has been using. One is to try to move the low-end work to interior parts of China, because China is a large country. There are big differences within China between one province and another. So the coastal provinces may have become too expensive for certain activities. Hey, but you create good infrastructure, railroads and roads and ports connecting and so on, all integrated. You can move it to the interior where the wages are lower. That way you can still keep some of the jobs in those provinces. That's still a losing battle. Eventually that will also become difficult. So the second thing you need to do is to automate. Especially now, China's run out of workers because the population, the working age population has already peaked. You then have to automate. China is spending a lot of money on robotics and automation. China is, in fact, one of the strongest players in robotics. With that, you can employ the same number of people and but they can be more productive. Third element is what you refer to, which is to move up the value curve and maybe shed some of the low-end work. And so if you were assembling laptops, you then get into, and you were assembling hard disk drives, you'd get into the intricate parts of it, which previously you were buying from Japan or Korea or someplace else, and try to make those in China. So moving up the value curve, automating to increase labor productivity, and shifting some of the production to lower wage locations within your own country, I think are three options for China. And China is pursuing all of those. And of course, developing entirely new products through basic research is also something that China has been doing a lot in the last decade.
Yeah, Professor, of course, China is the golden benchmark when it comes to innovation and exploring new ways of doing business. But do you see a lot of common grounds or more differences when it comes to emerging economies on the other side of the world, particularly Latin America? We are talking about some of the more successful companies like Mercado Libre, for example. That's a proven example of how e-commerce company can also survive in Latin America. So how do you see that side of the world rising up to the challenge when not only that they have to compete against the West, but also intense competition from East Asia in particular?
They're having some of the same problems you refer to in Indonesia, but they have the advantage they're not that close to China. So China finding it's being shut out more and more from the US and Europe has really directed a lot of its efforts in Southeast Asia. So I think in Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand, you've taken the brunt of that effect. But even Brazil feels the same problem. Brazilian companies struggle. If you're making motors in Brazil, they can't compete with the Chinese companies making motors. So some of the same problems exist even farther away, but it's attenuated by the impact of distance. In terms of their capacity to innovate, I don't see the same level of innovation in Latin America that I see in Asia. There are a few companies. There's a company called Embraer, they make aircraft. They have been making aircraft for a very long time. They have a very large presence in the US in regional jets, up to like 120 passengers. But every time you talk about Brazil, that's the only example that comes up. You don't have a long list of companies that are able to innovate, move up the value curve, improve productivity, and so on. So innovation is a challenge for much of Latin America.
And you see the government or state-owned companies are as involved in making sure that the investments go into the R&D of these homegrown companies, or are they more distant in comparison to East Asia or Southeast Asian experience? Because I'm saying this because we know for a fact that the Chinese state-owned companies are heavily involved in the private markets. So is Southeast Asia, and we have seen a proliferation of sovereign wealth funds, for example, being involved in not just state-owned companies, but investing into startups as well as SMEs for them to become regional champions. Is that also happening in Latin America, or less so?
No, it is happening in Latin America, not to the extent you have, say, in India or China, because India and China are now, as I'm sure you know, are the number in the top three in terms of startup ecosystem and in terms of the number of unicorns that they're producing. South America is not in that same league, but there are local VCs, foreign VCs operating in these countries. There are enormous opportunities to create a local version of Uber, a local version of e-commerce, a local version of, every one of these things you can create a local version of. It's not very innovative necessarily, but it still can be very rewarding. So there is that kind of innovation happening, and that kind of support for startups happening, even in South America. But it's not to the same extent as you see in China. India has now shown some real spark in terms of startups. But R&D, Indian companies are still not doing enough by way of R&D. They are just don't have a long-term view.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Much more short-sighted.
Yeah, that makes sense, really. Professor, I wanted to ask a bit more broadly about putting ourselves in the shoes of a policymaker or a politician in the emerging markets, right? Say I'm not China. Say I'm a much smaller country, basically, right? What are the things that I should do as a policymaker so that innovation really thrives, within the borders of my country, basically? What sort of top 3 or top 4 things I think they should start doing?
Deregulation of some kind, to some degree, is required. Because, entrepreneurs get very frustrated by all of the paperwork, and that is enough to kill many startups. So I think freeing up, especially for smaller companies, making it easier for them in terms of taxes, in terms of bureaucratic approvals and controls, probably helps. The second thing that I think the state has to do, that nobody else really can do, is invest in human capital. You have to, companies cannot always develop the human capital they need themselves. What they can do is they can do a little bit of finishing. They can take a college graduate who hasn't really learned everything properly, give them a year of training and preparation, and then put them into the workforce. But they still need the college graduate to be produced by the state. So investing in human capital, I think, is very, very important. A third element, I think, is opening up to the rest of the world. Countries are now looking a little bit more inward and thinking in terms of more protectionism. I don't think that is going to help with your innovation capacity. You do need a free movement of ideas. You need people to be able to borrow from other places, learn from other places, and a country that is more open will therefore be more successful, I think, on that front. And I think India, to some extent, is ticking some of the boxes. China may not tick all of the boxes, but it has such tremendous strength in terms of human capital and the entrepreneurial proclivity of its population. They're very, very entrepreneurial. Everybody wants their own business. That's kind of very much ingrained in a lot of Chinese people's thinking, and that helps with the entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that makes sense, really. And just on one of the points you mentioned about free trade and globalization. So I guess, in the 1940s, after the Bretton Woods conference, I think, more than 40 nations led by the umbrella of the US agreed to open up international trade, by lowering tariffs and ending quotas and promoting FDI and free movement of goods and capital. Currently, we're seeing quite a bit of reversal on that, where countries are going back. Obviously, again, led by the US, it's more protectionist, it's more inward, it's more America first, this and that, and so on and so forth, right? So what does that mean for emerging market countries, basically? Does that mean that they start forming coalitions by themselves, like a BRICS or something like that? Or, what sort of advice do you have for these emerging market economies, who want to do innovation, but in a world which is becoming less international trade and less globalization, and the geopolitics of where it's going today?
Yeah, I think you raise a real concern, because if you think of all of the developing countries that became rich in the last 50 years, almost all of them did so by exporting into the developed markets, Europe or US particularly. And now the US turning 180 degrees and going more protectionist means that opportunity, that window, may be closing for many countries that have not yet industrialized. China is lucky that it's already made that journey and moved up the value curve. India is still struggling and has, still not quite figured out how to seize the opportunity, as companies are rushing to leave China, but they're not going to India. They're going to Vietnam. They're going to some other places. Not enough for going to places like India. So if you lose access to the advanced country markets, your prospects for growth and therefore for, innovation are also diminished as a result of that process. So I think if I'm a emerging market in this kind of a situation, the idea that you brought up, I don't think the answer is therefore to close your own market and say, okay, US wants to go deglobalization, therefore I have to also do the same thing. No, I think the answer is to, and I think we're probably going to see this happen in the next few years, the countries, the rest of the world may decide, we want to create our own open global economy. If the US wants to opt out, India will sign a free trade agreement with the EU. EU will sign a free trade agreement with the Mercosur, as it already is negotiating, I believe. And South-South, you will see more partners. You mentioned the BRICS. The problem in the BRICS is the C part of it is a problem for the other countries. Because again, if China is part of this thing, then China will completely overwhelm all the other countries. But the other South countries in the South can open up to each other. India and Brazil could have a free trade agreement. So I hope what will happen is not that all countries decide to look inwards and raise walls like the US, but that the rest of the world will decide, let us keep our markets open, because in fact it has worked for us for 50 years. It has produced unprecedented growth and prosperity and peace for a very long period of time. Let's not throw the whole thing out. And I suspect at some point the US may come around.
Professor, we are aware that time is short. But I would like to hear your view on a quote from J.D. Vance, where he mentioned that the idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further out of the value chain, while poor countries made the simpler things. But it turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at designing of things. And here, cheap labor has become some sort of a drug, one that American firms get addicted to, often at the expense of long-term resilience and creativity. What's your view on that, Professor, as a last takeaway?
Here's the dilemma for the US. You have competing considerations. Everyone in society is both a producer and a consumer. When I am in my class, teaching a class, I am the producer, the students are consumers. In the evening, I go to a restaurant and have dinner, I'm the consumer, somebody else is the producer. If you only think of me as the whole population as only producers, right? What will happen is you will help producers, but at the expense of consumers. And unfortunately, there are many more consumers than there are producers for most products. So the dilemma will become, I want to help the steel worker. I want to help the company that makes something using the steel, and so on and so forth. If I help all of those producers and their workers, the price for my consumers will go up by a factor of 2. And if this happens across the board, across society, overall level of prices is bound to go up. So for a long period, we had consumer interest dominating these choices. We kept saying it's good for consumers, good for consumers. Oh, here and there a producer or a worker is getting hurt. That has accumulated over time to a lot of workers who've gotten hurt. And now they are organized and saying enough is enough. But if we go in the other direction, the price that we will probably have to pay is inflation, and prices will go up. Are we willing to pay that price? Basically, it's a view of trade as a zero-sum game. If I gain, you lose. If you lose, I gain. Whereas, in fact, it's not a zero-sum game. The answer is you have to make your country able to compete, not put up walls so you don't have to compete. And therefore, I'm really concerned that if we put up walls in the US, it will hurt American competitiveness. Even industries that are competitive will lose competitiveness. Industries that are not competitive may become competitive. But at the expense, everything will become more expensive. And at the end of the day, you will have a China that is actually creating very competitive companies. Say what you will about China, because of the internal competition that you talked about, the Chinese companies have become very, very resilient and fierce competitors. As a country, they are much more resilient. You know, when the first round of Trump tariffs were imposed, for 6 months, the economy cratered. 6 months later, it was back up again. They found something else to make for somebody else. Now, that is a hallmark of a resilient, adaptive, competitive economy. If you go in the other direction, I say that because I know. I grew up in India. In my youth, India had walls. And it was called import substituting industrialization. The problem with that was everything we made was very expensive, and we couldn't compete on anything except within India. All the producers could compete in India, but nowhere else.
Yeah.
You know, does the US want to do import substituting industrialization? Is that the way to go?
Yeah. It feels like back in the 18th century or 17th, mercantilism, I think, the economy, and interestingly, the Adam Smith Wealth of Nations was written against that whole theory, basically, right? But anyways, Professor, I had one last question. So you lead the Center for Emerging Market Studies at the Northeastern University. I was wondering, just curious, what are the new kind of research coming out, which is interesting? What are you guys working on right now? And what are you researching right now? And is there anything you can sort of share, which is quite interesting, basically?
Yeah, for me, my own work right now is focused on this new wave of innovation coming from the emerging markets. So we've already touched on it a bit. But I'm interested I like to look ahead and see what might be coming next. So that's the way my research is going. But some of my colleagues are working quite intently on the impact of AI, something we have not talked about at all. What is AI going to mean for the emerging markets? I have a speaker coming up in my center next week, a professor from HBS, who's talking about, AI and the changing geography of work. That is where people work, and that's completely changing. And what does that mean for the emerging markets? Right. So, and India has made its name for the software industry, but AI could completely change that because coding is disappearing as a
100%.
skill. So that's another area in which we have some people working. We have others working on supply chain issues. We have a team working on corporate governance in the emerging markets. So we have a couple of different, we have another on entrepreneurship and family business in the emerging markets. So we each do different things, but we like to share our findings because we share a common interest in the emerging markets.
Yeah, no, I mean, the center, when I looked at the publications and the whole concept was really fascinating. And this is something exactly what we need. And the thing about AI, I'm sure it's in everyone's agenda right now, but I'm sure it's going to be quite impactful given the next few years. It seems like we're going through another industrial revolution, so to speak, with AI. But Professor, with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for your time today and the very, very insightful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Afisi, good night.
Yeah,
or good morning.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor.
Yeah, sure. Bye.